You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature webcast and podcast series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business people. To make sense of these topics and how they could unfold, we sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this series. As the war in Ukraine continues to escalate, inflation rages, labor shortages persist, a direction of central bank monetary policy is in question, government spending continues, business leaders are faced with a plethora of issues. We just have issues all over the place, and the question now is, where do you turn? Today's conversation will focus on what's going on in the world and how business leaders should adapt. Joining me today is Dr. Lori Esposito Murray, the president of the Committee for Economic Development, which is the policy center, the public policy center of the Conference Board, Dana Peterson, the Conference Board's chief economist, Dr. Rebecca Ray, the head of our Human Capital Center, Paul Washington, the executive director of our ESG Center, and Ivan Pollard, the head of our Marketing Communications Center. You may know this, but the Conference Board was founded in 1916 as the National Industrial Conference Board. It was a conference or a group of industrial associations that got together to deal with the labor issues of the time. We were responsible for coming up with a 5-day, 40-hour work week and many of the safety standards that were not widely adapted in that era. So we have a long history of dealing with issues that are apropos and are current for business leaders. We now are one of the largest think tanks in the world with global offices and many centers. And we're going to start today by taking a look at the geopolitical situation in the world. And Dr. Lori Esposito Murray will lead off today with some commentary on that situation. So Lori, maybe we could start with what is top of mind, I think, for most business leaders. What is the current status of the Russia-Ukraine situation?
Well, Steve, thank you for hosting. It's a privilege to be a part of it. The first point I want to make that's extremely important is this is not just about Russia and Ukraine. And that's how it needs to be viewed by all leaders, political leaders, business leaders. This is really about a changing world order that's underway. We've already seen some of those changes already taking place. It's going to happen in the energy sector and the trade sector, where the supply chains come from, in the global financial world, as well as the power relationships among countries. It's global in its impact. But to just address your question specifically about the current status, the war is escalating, the economic war is escalating, the humanitarian crisis is escalating. The U.S. is sending more heavy equipment over to Ukraine. Russia has been widely reported preparing for major assaults on the Donbass region, and Ukraine is preparing to protect it. And you have the humanitarian crisis accelerating both within Europe, over 4 million refugees coming out of Ukraine, as well as the food crisis, the global food crisis that has been triggered by the fact that most of the wheat as well as grain and oils come out of Russia and Ukraine.
So, this may seem like a silly question at this point, but what is Russia trying to accomplish? What's their end game in this?
So Putin is very transparent. He's been transparent for years, ever since he came into power, about the collapse of the Soviet Union being the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. His interest in resurrecting Russian power, he even uses the word empire, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire. So he's very transparent in his overall strategic goals. What he's specifically trying to accomplish now in Ukraine is he had to pull back from his wider expectations, which, as we all have heard many times now about his hope to have been able to take over Ukraine, go into Kyiv, and within a couple of days, remove the government, put a friendly government in power. That approach failed. They failed in their assault on Ukraine, and he's had to pull back. Their supply chains were in trouble. And now they're reconfiguring under General Dvornikov, who actually ran the Syrian campaign and I believe won the nickname of being the Butcher of Syria, where, as you all know, chemical weapons were used quite extensively, as well as really dramatic and drastic attacks on civilians. So the sense is that what they're trying to do now is really consolidate. Mariupol is critical because it gives that land mass connection between Crimea and the Donbass, which improves Russia's supply chains to the Donbass region. Succeed there. And then the question is, what are Putin's goals after that? Will that division of Ukraine suffice, or will he actually mount a stronger attack against Ukraine?
And what do you think the answer to that is?
I think it all depends on how the Donbass region assault goes for him. This is really a pivotal moment for his leadership. The Russian army military has been humiliated in Ukraine, clearly unable to achieve their goals. The goals were reconfigured. Putin reconfigured the goals to take over the Donbass region. If they don't succeed in taking over the Donbass region, he has then invested a tremendous amount of money, which may have been corruptly used in other ways, to try and really resurrect a modern, technologically advanced military. If they fail in the Donbass region, then clearly he has failed as a leader of the country in terms of restoring important points of military power to Russia.
Yeah, when you were talking about the money, I think what you're talking about is how are they're financing it probably through this money that has been siphoned off, right? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was one tweet by a former Russian or a Russian oligarch saying, formerly no longer in good stead with the Kremlin, who indicated that what was happening in Ukraine shows you what happens when money for the military goes to yachts and villas. That was a slight window into what may have been happening in terms of Russia's military modernization efforts.
Right. So is there an off ramp here that you see that would allow Russia to sort of ease back and or is this just total annihilation of Ukraine and it's just a matter of time?
Annihilation or failure on the part of Russia. And I think there have been a couple of pivotal turning points here in terms of off ramps, and obviously the slaughters that took place in Bucha, which have an important number of international visitors have gone and have said that it really was genocide, is how they're talking about what happened in Bucha and what's happening to the Ukrainian civilians. That was a major turning point. It was a major turning point in terms of United States rhetoric, with the president actually calling Putin a war criminal. These are really important turning points as far as negotiations or off-ramps go. When you have a leader doing an unprovoked attack on a sovereign nation and then actually overseeing the slaughter of civilians, and you combine that with the rhetoric that is being used in Russia to explain the war and explain the purpose of the war to the Russian people, it's very hard to see how you actually negotiate your way out of a crisis like this. And even if Putin wins militarily, what's really important to recognize is that this war isn't over. The economic sanctions will stay on. And I'm talking about even if he succeeds just in this Donbass area and doesn't try to overtake the rest of Ukraine, the economic sanctions stay on. The economic war continues, and we have half the world supporting those sanctions and half the global GDP, countries that represent the other half of the global GDP, not supporting those countries.
Well, that's a really important point because both China and now India have thrown in. Talk about what's going on with this new axis of powers: China, India, and Russia. What were the agreements, and where's this going to go?
Well, what's really significant is that Putin had two very important visits. And I know we very much have focused on one because to China in February, because it happened right at the Olympics. But he actually had two very important visits before he invaded Ukraine. And one was in December. The United States was very public and open about the fact that our intelligence, and sharing our intelligence, that Putin intended to invade Ukraine. And at that time, in December 6th, Putin actually visited India. While this was all publicly well known. And while he was in India, similar to what happened in China in February, he actually signed a major statement of friendship, 99 principles of partnership for peace and progress and prosperity with Prime Minister Modi. And so very similar to the statement that he actually signed, where his relationship with China was limitless. They have a strategic partnership that he followed up in February. And similar to what happened in China, there were many pieces of contracts that were parts of that. In India, Modi and Putin agreed that they would increase bilateral trade to 30 billion by 2035. It's about 8 billion now. They also continue to finalize the deal for the $5.4 billion surface-to-air missiles, the S-400s to India, which has been a sale of concern to us. And we have shared that with Modi. They agreed to actually manufacture Russian assault rifles in India and agreed to continue their military program, not only in terms of exports and imports, but also in terms of investment in manufacturing during that time. So a number of really significant agreements, also in gas, oil, gas, coal, steel. I think the Indian foreign minister actually indicated there are about 28 of those agreements that they signed at the time. And similarly, Putin goes off to China and does the same thing with Xi Jinping, where there's a $117 billion agreement on oil and gas imports, as well as, as I had mentioned, they're sealing their strategic relationship, which they considered limitless, and lifting the embargo on importing Russian wheat and grains.
So from a Western business perspective, you've got the energy issues from the Russia-Ukraine situation, oil and gas predominantly, but food, but for sure beyond that. You've got the situation with China, and people saying now they should, that this could exacerbate the China-Taiwan situation, and people ought to relocate supply chain for semiconductors. But should Western nations be thinking about, you got food and energy, should they be thinking about beyond that? Should they be proactively moving their supply chains out of Taiwan and China as well?
So that is an extremely important question, and is part of even a larger question in terms of preparing for what is already and will continue to be, I believe, a fractured global financial and economic system. There's no going back. The sanctions will remain on Russia. What's interesting is the SWIFT sanction kicking Russia out of the SWIFT financial messaging. Russia was actually preparing for that. It was preparing for that with India and China. With China, they both were developing an alternative SWIFT mechanism, and Foreign Minister Lavrov was when he was just visiting Modi on April 1st, Prime Minister Modi talked about really incorporating India into that system. What's also fascinating about what's happening in terms of financially and imports and export exchanges, that in the fourth quarter of 2020, 10% of Russian trade was in dollars. In 2013, just before Crimea, 95% of Russian trade was in dollars. So they have been moving towards a very fractured financial system where the US dollar isn't the primary dominant currency, and which also affects US leadership. And that gets you to, where do your supply chains come from? And that's to your question about Taiwan. That is really a very serious and important question that the U.S., its allies and partners have to be looking at supply chains. And there are two ways to do it. One is completely onshoring, and the way that the IMF has just come out, and CED has actually recommended this in our reports as well, which is the popular term for it now is friendshoring, moving your supply chains to your closer partners and allies to assure resiliency, as well as moving what needs to come home.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing for the Western companies to say we're going to pull out of Russia, which is always a small portion, small country, economically, but to pull out of China would be to deal with an embedded supply chain that supplies, the rest of the globe. So it's quite a bit different, but it looks like this is something that, firms are going to have to start focusing on.
Right, and it's going to take years. I mean, it will take years to make these transitions, but you have to start focusing on it now.
Right. Lori Murray, thank you for that overview. And now I'd like to shift to the implications of all of this on the economy and the global economy, but also the U.S. economy. And so we're going to turn to our chief economist, Dana Peterson. Dana, thanks again for joining us. So given the situation, this geopolitical situation, what are our projections now? What are your projections for global and U.S. GDP, inflation, unemployment? How do you see things shaking out?
Sure. I think it's important to just note that we're seeing simultaneous shocks here on the global economy that's going to have a very negative feedback loop on many economies, including the U.S. Those shocks include many of the things that you've spoken to Laurie about already in terms of higher prices for raw materials, including for oil, natural gas, food, metals, and also for assorted things that go into semiconductors. We're also seeing shocks on globalized supply chains. Indeed, the pandemic is still enduring, and we're seeing shocks come out of China, but the war itself in Ukraine is also creating these supply chain shocks throughout Europe that are also filtering through the rest of the world, especially for intermediate goods. So with all of that, we have actually downgraded our global growth forecast for this year and next year relative to what we were thinking before the war began. So for global GDP, initially we were looking at growth of 3.9% this year. Now we're looking at 3.3% for this year. And for next year, we cut our forecast by a 10th, so from 2.7 to 2.6%. For the US, we also made similar downgrades. So we cut our US growth forecast this year by about 0.5 percentage point. So we're looking at 3% growth this year. And for next year, we cut our growth rate by, I believe, about 1 or 0.2 percentage point, so 2.2%. So when we look at these growth rates, they are not signaling recession, but certainly much slower growth now than what we were anticipating before the war.
Right, and then inflation plays a big role in your projections as well.
Absolutely. In fact, for Russia and Ukraine, we do expect recessions. Russia, because of the financial sanctions that are preventing them from engaging fully in the global economy. Ukraine, because that's the theater of war. There's physical disruption and destruction, and you also have a massive migration crisis. As Laurie said, over 4 million people have fled the country. We are going to see weakness in Europe and throughout the world, but in Europe, a lot of that's going to be a function of the supply chains being disrupted. But for the rest of the world, a lot of that's going to be a function of elevated inflation. Again, we're seeing prices rise for raw materials that are feeding up through intermediate goods, through final goods, and it's affecting businesses, certainly in terms of transportation, as well as production of goods, and they're passing those costs on to consumers. And so, especially in the US case, the worsening, or rather the downgrades in growth, reflect very much higher inflation.
Right, and then you have virtually full employment and wages are skyrocketing at the same time, which of course contributes to that inflation as well.
In the US, that's definitely true. We are anticipating that the measure of inflation that the Federal Reserve pays very much a close attention to is the personal consumption expenditure inflation gauge. So that's essentially whatever consumers are buying, goods or services. And that measure may top out very close to 7% this year, potentially in the second quarter. And the measure looking at this, excluding food and energy, which is called the core, could top out very close to 6%. Now, these rates are the highest we've seen in 40 years. So this is very strong inflation. And so when we think about these inflation drivers, they're demand drivers and they're supply drivers. Demand drivers include, as you said, full employment. So most people in the US are working. We're also seeing wages rise, and many people still have some leftover money from the fiscal stimulus that was implemented last year. So people received actual cash checks, and some of that they spent, but some of it they also saved. And so you have that very strong demand from higher incomes and full employment. Meanwhile, you have supply drivers of inflation, which include disruptions to supply chains that cause prices to rise, and also higher costs for basic materials, including food and energy. And so combining those things together, we're looking at higher inflation, not only across the world, but especially in the United States. And the war is exacerbating the supply side pressures that we're seeing.
Yeah. So in the U.S. Specifically, there are really only two kind of levers here. There are fiscal levers and monetary levers. Fiscal levers meaning what Congress spends, and as you said, the stimulus contributed to the situation. Talk about what you think that the U.S. government will do from a fiscal standpoint, and then what the Fed will do from a monetary perspective.
Sure. From what the government can do is address factors that contribute to supply chain disruptions or higher inflation. So first of all, we're not expecting any more fiscal stimulus. Certainly if the current administration does not maintain a mandate, meaning control over both the White House as well as both chambers of Congress, we probably won't see any new legislation come forth that would increase inflation. But certainly the government and federal and state and local governments can potentially lower taxes on gasoline or allow or remove some of the regulations that prevent drilling on public lands. And indeed, some of these things are already underway. So there are many things that the government can do. But I think with respect to addressing inflation, a lot of this is a big question for the central bank. Now, I mentioned supply and demand drivers of inflation. The central bank can address the demand elements of inflation with raising interest rates and also reducing the size of its balance sheet. The Fed can do very little about addressing the supply side or these external factors. The Fed can't stop the war, and they also can't stop shutdowns in China due to the pandemic. What the Fed is going to do is raise the federal funds rate, the rate at which all other interest rates are based off of, from roughly 0% earlier this year to 2% later this year, or even 3% next year. And so we're looking at higher interest rates. And also the Fed's going to reduce the size of its balance sheet. So far, it's saying it's going to cut the size of the balance sheet by $95 billion per month. Even still, if the Fed did that starting from May until next year, you'd still have a very sizable balance sheet. So there's a lot of work that the Fed must do to reduce the amount of accommodative monetary policy.
Right. It would take almost 7 years to work off their balance sheet at the rate they're going. So finally, how are you seeing all of this play with consumer confidence and CEO confidence?
Sure. With regards to consumer confidence and CEO confidence, we've seen both of those measures come off of the highs that were experienced amid the pandemic. So in the fall, the CEO confidence measure rose to the highest measure reading ever on record for that. And certainly with consumer confidence, it did not re-achieve the pre-pandemic level, but it still was materially better than during the worst of the pandemic. But since then, we've seen those measures come off, signaling that both consumers and CEOs anticipate some slowing in activity. And of course, we were going to see some slowing in GDP growth anyway. Last year, we saw really outsized growth fueled by fiscal and monetary policy, as well as an improving labor market. And so that's just not sustainable. But certainly we're seeing businesses and consumers saying that they're concerned about higher inflation, interest rates rising, the potential for even a recession in the US or even globally. And that's starting to be reflected in both of those measures.
Right, but you're not projecting a recession to happen, right?
No, we're not projecting a recession either on the global level or for the US, but certainly there are many risks and events that can happen that would push us into recession.
Right. And so CEO confidence is starting to slip a little bit. That's important because they control the investments, and consumer confidence is starting to slip a little bit. And that's important because they control the spending, which is really important. So all these things. So you got some worried people out there, consumers and CEOs both, don't you?
Yes, we do. And we have already incorporated these kinds of concerns into our outlook. We're expecting higher inflation. We're also expecting slower growth. Again, anticipating that this angst that's building up amongst consumers and CEOs actually becomes realized in actual activity and within the data.
Right. That's great. Dana Peterson, thanks so much for joining us. That was a great overview.
Thank you.
So we've talked about the state of geopolitics and economics. Next, we'll talk about the implications for human capital, ESG, and marketing communications. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back.
As war rages in Ukraine, the Conference Board is closely monitoring the situation and producing timely and relevant content on a daily basis that will help the business community navigate this global geopolitical unrest. What will the impact be on oil prices, food prices, our supply chain, and what about cybersecurity? How will this conflict impact the way your organization does business around the world? And how will you communicate this crisis to customers and employees? We're gathering the very latest content on our website. Just head to conference-board.org and find trusted insights to help you and your team lead with confidence.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board. And we're going to turn now to the human capital, ESG, and marketing communications implications to navigating this geopolitical and economic environment. Let's start with the human capital side. Dr. Rebecca Ray is with us. Dr. Ray runs our Human Capital Center. Rebecca, thanks for joining us.
Steve, it's a real pleasure. And I'm always appreciative of the times I get to hear from my colleagues when they just very succinctly break through and provide the kinds of understanding that I think all of us are struggling with.
I couldn't agree more. Rebecca, the globe has really faced, three major shocks in the past couple of years. First of all, with the outbreak of COVID, then all the social justice issues, and now the war in Ukraine. How should leadership, should CEOs, CHROs, the C-suite be thinking about leadership differently today than they were just 3 years ago?
Sure. Thanks for that question. I think every organization has asked a great deal from leaders at all levels in their organizations over these past few years. And I think the toll that it's taken is palpable. We've asked them to support employees through a myriad of challenges, including health challenges, a lack of adequate childcare, and for many, a social justice movement that enveloped and impacted many of them in a very personal way. And now we're dealing with an unfolding humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, which calls many employees to speak out or take action or to witness their organizations doing so. And leaders are now expected to soldier on despite how many of these black swan, once-in-a-generation events happen regularly and simultaneously. And we've asked leaders to deliver business results while being flexible about shifts and remote working, and shift to remote working in many cases, and being attentive to signs of anxiety, declines in mental health and well-being. And they're doing this at the same time that they're experiencing challenges of their own. There used to be the phrase when you were boarding a plane, they tell you to put your own mask on first in case you needed to help others. And leaders need to do that too, because most leaders have stepped up, but this has been a marathon and not a sprint, and they're pretty exhausted.
Yeah, it is exhausting at all levels, and people seem to be stressed. What do our data show? What do your surveys show about how employees are feeling?
Well, I do think there is a great deal of anxiety among employees, and I think that's to be expected to a certain extent. And they have been anxious about their own personal situation. We don't have to go any further than Maslow's hierarchy of needs in our Psych 101 class. But when you have food insecurity, or you're concerned about job security, or you're losing loved ones, or you're caring for them, or you have the additional pressures of performing in the workplace or virtually, as the case may be, and you still have childcare or elder care issues, these have been very stressful times for many. But I think the good news is that despite the declines in self-reported levels of mental health, well-being, rising levels of burnout, lower engagement levels, generally speaking, that has been the story for quite a few. But when we asked very specifically in this last month about how they thought leadership had fared during the last couple of years, most people felt that leaders had done a pretty good job, that they had become more empathetic, that they had become more open to concerns that employees have or to requests for flexibility, whether that looks like a flexible schedule or a remote work, or it looks like a hybrid, or it looks like the ability to work in a different location that might be closer to home. I think people have tried very hard to take care of each other, which is always, I think, the mark of a good team, that they try to cover for each other. But I think this requires a different type of leadership. I do think that you're looking for leaders now who not only deliver the business results that are expected, but they need to become more empathetic. They need to become able to be effective in both a hybrid and a face-to-face and a completely virtual world. And they have to work harder, I think, for team cohesion and engagement. They have to be very thoughtful about individual development and advancement. And they also have to make sure that they have an inclusive, fair, a level playing field environment, no matter what the working conditions might be, and that they don't fall victim to proximity bias. The person that's in the office and sitting right there that they may see a little bit more often, that's not the first person you think of when it's time for a plum assignment or developmental opportunity or coaching. But the good news is that most people felt during the many times we surveyed them during the pandemic in particular, that the most important thing that could help with their mental health or anxiety was a caring, supportive manager and flexibility to handle a lot of life's really difficult challenges. So I think that bodes well for leadership.
Yeah, I think this last point is really, really important, Rebecca, that you're making, because I think that leaders are accustomed to dealing with the stresses of the work environment. This is the first time that I can remember where you really do have to, as a leader, take into account the home environment, the life part of work life. And it's because of all these stresses, that came upon us. People are dealing with family, elder care, childcare, remote learning. They're worried about, are they going to get sick or worse? There's some existential issues in this. I think leaders have had to stand back and say, okay, wait a minute. If this isn't just about the work environment, this is about holistically the work-life environment, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And I think companies who want to attract and retain employees are going to be ahead of the game in a very hyper-competitive labor market when they can build a place that is known for being a great place to work, that they themselves are magnets for talent, and that they themselves are creating the next generation of leaders. And those are the kinds of leaders we have to support, because that's the linchpin here. Organizations really need to make sure that these leaders are supported themselves, because not only are they leading, but they're also an employee and they have their own little basket of things that they're dealing with.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of things that leaders are thinking about, but what can leaders do specifically in a time like this to help their people?
I think some of it is simply reaching out. It's we all get caught up in this deadline or that problem or this issue. And, I used to do a lot of training of managers on Wall Street, and it was always feelings before facts and people before problems. And if you don't handle the feelings and the people part first, it really doesn't matter what you then expect them to do. So I think they need to outreach more. I think they need to listen more. And I think they need to be attentive to the signs of distress, whatever that may look like, and be able to marshal the troops to support that person.
Yeah, and you've written and spoken pretty widely about flexibility, being flexible in how you deal with individuals and how you accommodate them, right?
I think it's the right thing to do. Yes. I also think that the market is such that you have a generation, that we could talk all day if it's the great resignation, the great reset, the great reimagining, or use any other R word you like. But you've got a generation of people, the ones who are mostly on the move are the millennials that you would expect given their life stage. This is where they are. And also there wasn't as much movement in 2020. So you had a lot that was pent up in 2021. So, you've got a lot of people who are looking for that flexibility. So if leaders and organizations can't sort of meet them there, they will go somewhere where they can find that flexibility. And as mentioned, in the past, they want to be connected to an organization whose mission and purpose aligns with theirs. And they'll keep searching until they find it. And what's interesting about this generation is they'll leave even if they don't have something else in hand. That's how strongly they believe about it.
Yeah, it's a real change. So, pre-pandemic, we spoke about either remote or in person. And gosh, it just seems like that's all blown up now, and it's, everything's hybrid. It's some balance of one, of the two rather than one or the other. Is that the way you think of it? In our, are we just in a hybrid world forever?
I think it's going to be a mix of all kinds of things, not only where you work, but it's who's working for you. So I think the old traditional ways that we used to think about planning, these many jobs, these kinds of things, these retirement rates, that's all been blown up. We need to be thinking in terms of skill sets and having people who are plug and play in a variety of ways. And it's going to look like a variety of types of workers for quite some time. And it is going to be difficult because we are so used to sort of standardizing things. And this is the job, and these are the benefits, and this is the work schedule. And that's great. And that may work in some situations. But even in manufacturing environments, for example, they are looking at how flexible can they be on a shift on a particular work line so that the business continues to go, but you're also being able to retain workers. And so flexibility is going to be forced upon organizations, even if it's not their first default choice. But many are being very thoughtful. That's what's encouraging to me, to the CHROs and other leaders that I speak with, is how they are truly trying to help people find the right balance and make where they work the great place to work.
So flexibility and empathy are really the key characteristics of leadership that are going to have to carry us forward, with an environment like that.
I think so. And it's a different way of thinking for some people, but I feel confident we can get there as a nation.
Yeah, great. Rebecca Ray, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us. That's terrific. And now, as Rebecca has talked about the new kind of world of leading from a human capital standpoint, so too do we have to think about the multiple constituency world. And joining us is Paul Washington, the leader of our Environmental, Social, and Governance Institute. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Yeah. So, COVID, civil society, Ukraine, we were just talking with Rebecca. We've gone from one issue to the next. How has all of this affected ESG in a multi-stakeholder world?
Well, it certainly hasn't made it easier. I think you've heard that. So I think the headline is that these shocks that we've undergone as a society have really accelerated two underlying shifts. The first shift is from stockholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. Now, let me preface that and explain that a bit. Companies have always needed to have engaged employees, happy customers, healthy communities. But what's happened with the pandemic and these other shocks is a heightened focus on the long-term welfare of your employees, your customers, and your communities as legitimate goals in and of themselves. And we've seen this in the surveys we've done of C-suite executives. 90% of executives around the world believe that these shifts are underway, and 80% believe they're happening at their own company. And as we're seeing this shift to a stakeholder world, employees, it's not a surprise, employees are rising in importance. At the outset of the pandemic, their health and welfare was the #1 issue for US companies right after liquidity. And even today, we're seeing boards and C-suites prioritize employees as never before. The second shift underway was a focus on broader environmental and social and governance issues. And here we see more people focused on sustainability and ESG issues than ever before. Certainly true of investors. It's also true of your business partners. We've got a report coming out soon that says 70% of procurement executives are screening your company for sustainability. And in this shift, what's also rising? Well, climate is still awfully important, but social issues are very important to all of these constituencies. And my colleague Ivan will go soon, and he can talk too about how for consumers, employee welfare, labor conditions, wages, those are top S issues. So it's been an accelerant on these underlying shifts.
Top S issues, meaning social issues. And that comes back to the multi-stakeholder piece. Multi-stakeholders, the stakeholders are customers, employees, owners, community, environment. And so business leaders need to balance all of that, is what I'm hearing you say. And so, in the context of ESG, you can't just think about environment, which is kind of where people go when they hear the term ESG, but it's really balancing all of those stakeholders, right?
Exactly right. And look, what's happening, there's this cumulative impact that's occurred that I actually think has a silver lining in it in some ways. At the board level, what we're seeing is, because boards were meeting more often and in a constant crisis situation over the last couple of years, the degree of transparency between management and the board has increased. And that in turn has increased the level of trust. People have greater sense of their own capabilities. But going forward, what's going to be really important is for boards to address the stakeholder world and ESG issues through the prism of strategy, through their business strategy. And to do that, there's a lot of focus on trying to get, do we have this expert on our board, that expert on our board? I think what you really need to do is have broad board fluency in the wider range of issues, greater board education about the interests of stakeholders. And then you also want directors who bring certain soft skills. Crisis management is a really important one. You want directors who are there to listen and learn and not just lecture. So there's a real impact in the boardroom and the C-suite from these cumulative shocks.
So part of the ESG, terminology is the environment. And when you think about ESG, you go to sustainability goals. And this is a weird time because now all of a sudden we have a bit of a global energy crisis with the Ukraine-Russia situation. And of course, that region provided a lot of energy to Western Europe and the world. That's now changing. And so companies need to rethink their sources of energy and so forth. And so how should, we could go broadly to governments, but how should companies be thinking about sustainability goals? Should they just give up on these long-term goals, or should they just say, let's keep going forward, but let's also deal with the short-term context?
Well, you need to do both, right? And so I think in the near term, for example, with energy, you're obviously seeing a shift away from sources of natural gas and oil from Russia to other sources, right? But it has actually heightened the focus of boards and senior executives on the need to move toward renewable, resilient, sustainable supplies of energy. Now, the key thing here, I think, is to get out of the world of abstract goals associated with, 2 degrees Celsius, 1.5 degrees Celsius, and for boards and management to grapple with what does the energy transition look like for our company. That's absolutely key. Dana and I wrote a piece on this recently, and every company needs to be looking at this, large and small. And I will tell you, the big companies are out there already focusing on it. There's a real vulnerability we have as a society when 84% of companies with 50 billion of revenue or more are talking about greenhouse gas emissions, but the number when you're talking in the 1 to 5 billion is only 30% of those firms. They've got a role to play here too.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is, don't give up on net zero, don't give up on a carbon-free world, but at the same time, we have to live to get there.
Exactly right.
Deal with it the best we can in the short term. Yeah. And that relates to another issue which we raised, Dana raised as it relates, and Lori raised as well as it relates to Ukraine. And that's food and food security. And obviously, disruption here in Ukraine, which is a large grain exporter for the world. Feedstocks will be depleted. If the feedstocks are very expensive, it will impact protein prices. So it's not just grain. This is really pretty important. How should food companies or other businesses be thinking about food versus ESG goals? In other words, there's water usage, fertilizers, GMOs, all of these issues which companies have been focused on from an ESG standpoint. But you have to feed people first, right?
That's exactly right. And look, in the long run, obviously, these good environmental practices, good ESG practices go hand in hand with increased food production, increased food security, feeding the world. So we know that's true. But in the near term, you got to keep people fed. And I think one of the key things for companies to do here is to have policies that allow them, as you suggested earlier, to balance the competing interests of long-term and short-term and different stakeholders. Companies should not only build into their strategy, but into policies. So for example, policies on biodiversity that enable you to make those trade-offs. Unfortunately, only about 15% of the S&P 500 have those sorts of policies. So policy is one approach. It's also a focus on technology, right? Because you need to focus on technology if you're in the food industry, both on the supply side in terms of land management and so forth, and diversifying food sources, as well as on the demand side from consumers and healthier diets and so forth. Just a final point, companies need to make their own tailored strategies, but they cannot do this on their own. Obviously, there's a need for public-private partnership, but also industry-wide partnerships, because this is something that needs to be addressed throughout the supply chain and even collaborating with your competitors.
Yeah, and Paul, we've just barely scratched the surface on ESG, but it is so fascinating how the issues of geopolitics, the issues of the economic situation, human capital are all interrelated with ESG. And I think one of the things that we've been talking about a lot more is how you cannot do this in a vacuum. It's all interrelated.
It is, and the one thing I'd add, just Steve, is that the conference board is unique in this area in that we don't rank companies. We across the board, as you're hearing, we're there to provide information, insights, and tools to help companies chart their own course in this new era. And you're hearing it from my colleagues that we're all in that game.
Paul Washington, thanks for being with us today and talking through the ESG issues. So another way that all of this is integrated is in how companies market to their customers and their consumers, how they communicate to their multi-stakeholders, and also obviously that includes employees and internal communications. And joining us to discuss all of that is Ivan Pollard, the leader of our Marketing Communications Center. Ivan, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Steve.
So given the state of the world and what we've heard from Lori, Dana, and Paul and Rebecca, how do you see the role of the Chief Communications Officer today, and how has it changed from just a few short years ago?
Well, I think my colleagues have painted a glorious picture of all that's going on in the world. I think I'd go a step further than Rebecca did. I don't think this is a marathon. I think we're going through a triathlon with all the challenges that brings. Cold water, flat tires, blisters on our feet and holes in our shoes, but we are going to keep going. And as Paul said, there's some good things that have come out of this, like the acceleration of digital technology, capability and availability. So all of those things have changed the role of the Chief Communications Officer. And our research has shown us three major themes. First, the expectation for companies to speak up on the issues at hand are greater than they've ever been before, and the background is changing more rapidly than before, and therefore the CCO has been pulled closer to the center of business operations. Secondly, the CCO has become much more involved in strategy. For example, our latest report says 36% of CCOs are deeply involved in corporate strategy, and more of them are reporting directly to the CEO, 46% versus 37% in 2015. So the CEO is holding them close. And thirdly, as Paul said, and as you articulated, stakeholder management is now, it's a real craft, an art and a science. And it means that the CCO is involved in more parts of the business with more work to do, but more partnerships across the business than ever before. So if I had to sum that up in a pithy one-liner, I think the CCO has rapidly evolved from being a reactive agent for the business to a proactive leader.
Yeah, and that's really so important. So that's the communications piece of it, but the marketing piece of it also has undergone incredible challenges as you see chief marketing officers wrestle with the geopolitical and also political and social tensions on top of it. Should marketers be taking sides? Should they be, branding, and aligning their brands with Russia or Ukraine or, red shirts, blue shirts, political parties? Is that smart?
Well, I think it can be. I think I'd stick by the maxim of you've got to put your people before your politics, of course. And I think the critical question is, who do you aspire to serve and do business with? Of course, there are advantages for many by remaining broad and unbiased and being for everybody. But as Paul said, you have to stand for something these days, especially if you're a brand. And that brand, if you want it to be valued by each special someone, you better have a point of view. So yes, if pulling on a blue shirt or a red shirt brings you closer to an audience that you really believe you can do business with, then that must be a consideration. However, a word of warning, take care, because your audience can change their shirt in the blink of an eye. Whereas if you commit to a blue or red shirt, that's going to last on your back for a long time.
And we're just using the blue and the red shirt as just one dimension, but that comes back to multiple stakeholders, because as you think about marketing and communicating in a multi-stakeholder world, customers, employees, owners, community, environment, they are not unilateral. You have, they are people of all different political persuasions and, different points of view. So by definition, if you do focus narrowly, you really can cause some angst among the balance of the stakeholders. So talk about marketing and communications in a multi-stakeholder world.
Well, Paul put it beautifully and summed up, the stakeholders that you have to take account of. And I do believe all stakeholders are created equal, but some are obviously more equal than others. So again, our research in the C-suite outlook that Paul referenced clearly states that the first and foremost is your customer or your consumer. So if you want to grow as a business and you want to serve as a marketer the business, then holding on to that customer is your key priority as a stakeholder. Peter Drucker said the purpose of a business is to create a customer and to retain that customer. However, your employees, again, in the C-suite Outlook survey, they came a very close second, and the elevating need of a company and this notion of stakeholder capitalism, you better be thinking about how you communicate your point of view to your employees and how that is consistent with what you're saying to your consumers. And then I believe actually the current situation, this is why situational scenario planning is so important for CMOs and CCOs. The current situations to then dictate who you listen to next, although I would have a plea to say that the environment should come next. Perhaps it's the most vital for all of us. And companies, as Paul said, have a huge role, and Dana referenced this too, a huge role to play in the partnerships that we can make happen to make the planet habitable for our great-grandchildren. But you better listen to all of them. You don't have to serve them the same, is what I would say if you're a CMO or a CCO thinking about stakeholders.
Yeah, and in a B2B world where it's a knowledge-based economy, to a large extent, you also have to think about your employees as your brand, as they're out there engaging, and it's a real interesting balancing act for these marketers.
Yeah, I think I'd go one step further. They're not just your brand; they're your communications channel as well. So they're a medium that you could use.
Great point. Last word is yours. Any other advice that you'd share?
Well, I'm going to say something that I've heard for 35 years, which there's never been a better time to be in marketing and communications. The landscape's changing all the time, of course, but right now those changes and those opportunities and pressures to learn are immense. So I'd say stay relentlessly curious, be open to learning what's new, but never forget that the way that you shape the story that comes off that learning is all down to the creativity with which you do it.
And you have to keep all your stakeholders in balance. Ivan, Pollard, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
So thanks to Lori, Dana, Rebecca, Paul, and Ivan for joining us and sharing their insights in a tumultuous world. And thanks to all of you for listening into CEO Perspectives. Every week I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader or two or five to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover, as you've seen today, the leading topics in geopolitics, economics, public policy, ESG, human capital, marketing, communications, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family. Everybody will want to hear. I'm Steve Odland, CEO of the Conference Board, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Conference Board, your source of trusted insights for what's ahead. For the latest insights to help guide your business through this time of geopolitical unrest, we have daily and relevant updates on our website at conference-board.org.